As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room and communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that, as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. Soon it rang out loudly, and did so every bell in the house. This was succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chair over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. It came on through the heavy door, and a spectre passed into the room before his eyes, and upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up, as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost." The same face, the very same, Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and through, and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and noticed the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, he was still incredulous. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, "No doubt about it." "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that, in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe me?" "I don't." "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond your senses?" "I don't know." "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his horror. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round his head as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. "Mercy! Dreadful apparition! Why do you trouble me? Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do you come to me?" "It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. I cannot tell you all I would. A very little more is permitted to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting-house. Mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. This is, of course, the scene from A Christmas Carol written by Charles Dickens when Ebenezer Scrooge is first confronted with his dear, deceased business partner, Jacob Marley. And I bring it to you because I think that it perfectly encapsulates what it is that is a ghost story. There are, of course, simpler answers. However, I hope to drill down a little deeper in today's video. But when you ask Google what is a ghost story, probably you will get the entry from Wikipedia on ghost story. Surprise. Wikipedia tells us, quote, "A ghost story is any piece of fiction or drama that includes a ghost, or simply takes a premise, the possibility of ghosts or characters believe in them. The ghost may appear of its own accord or be summoned by magic. Linked to the ghost is the idea of a haunting, where a supernatural entity is tied to a place, object, or person." End quote. I will contend a little bit with that. That is not necessarily the case, that a haunting is something which is confined to a space. But anyway, the entry carries on. Quote, "Colloquially, the term ghost story can refer to any kind of scary story. In a narrower sense, the ghost story has been developed as a short story format within genre fiction. It is a form of supernatural fiction and specifically of weird fiction, and is often a horror story. While ghost stories are often explicitly meant to scare, they have been written to serve all sorts of purposes, from comedy to morality tales. Ghosts often appear in the narratives as sentinels or prophets of things to come. Belief in ghosts is found in all cultures around the world, and thus ghost stories may be passed down orally or in written form." End quote. And as we explored last week, that there might be something to the horror genre which is indelibly human, something inherently literary to the idea of horror fiction, which is its deep connection to the human experience. And if that is true, and I'm inclined to believe that it is, there may be no going back any further in the horror genre than the ghost story. In fact, one of the oldest written texts that we have, one of the oldest stories we know, is an ancient Egyptian ghost story, but not necessarily of the religious variety. It would be understandable, I think, if one of the oldest texts we have about ghosts is in some type of religious format. But this story is only tertiarily related to religiosity. It is known as the story of Khonsuemheb and the ghost. Understandably, the beginning of the text is missing. After all, it is from around 1100 BC. And just sort of as a personal aside, I've had to buy about 4 copies of the Myth of Sisyphus just because I keep losing it. And I haven't been trying to keep it for anywhere near 3,100 years. Worldhistory.org tells us of the actual story, quote, "Scholars differ on interpreting the text. Some claim it is a first-person narration by a speaker who spends the night in the necropolis at Thebes and is encountered by an angry spirit. This nameless narrator then goes to the high priest to seek his help, and Khonsuemheb raises the spirit to talk to it. The first-person narrator interpretation rests entirely on one of the early lines. Other scholars claim it is a third-person narration, which tells how Khonsuemheb encountered the spirit in the necropolis, and then dedicated himself to helping it find peace. The beginning of the story is as fragmentary as the conclusion, which breaks off, so it is understandable how one concludes the I mentioned at the start indicates the first-person narration. The story makes more sense as third-person omniscient narration. However, as no first-person narrator makes an appearance after the opening line, these lines could, in fact, be dialogue spoken by Khonsuemheb. Some translations, in fact, omit the I in the opening lines entirely, attributing them to Khonsuemheb, without any effect on the story's cohesion. Either way, after two lines which relate to some sort of journey, Khonsuemheb returns to his house and calls on the spirit to come to him and identify himself, promising to help him by building a new sepulchre and providing him with all sorts of things. It is clear that the high priest is already aware of the spirit's troubles. The ghost appears and says his name is Nebuchadnezzar. Khonsuemheb asks the spirit what is troubling him, and Nebuchadnezzar replies that his tomb has fallen and no one now remembers where he is buried, so that proper offerings are no longer brought. Nebuchadnezzar says he is exposed in the wintry wind, hungry, without food, and he fears he may soon cease to exist, or, as he puts it, to overflow like the inundation, and be lost because his soul has no home to contain it. Khonsuemheb assures the spirit that he will do everything he can for him, saying, "Please express to me a fine commission such as it is fit to be done for you, and I will surely have it done for you." But the spirit is not convinced. Nebuchadnezzar says, "Of what use are the things you would do? Unless a tree is exposed to sunlight, it does not sprout foliage," meaning that he does not expect the priest to be able to provide him with the kind of home he once had, as Khonsuemheb does not have those kinds of resources. Just as a tree cannot blossom without sunlight, his tomb cannot be rebuilt on promises and goodwill. The priest has assured him already that if he cannot build him a new tomb, he will have 5 men servants and 5 maid servants bring him food and water as offerings daily. But the spirit would not be consoled. Nebuchadnezzar disappears, but Khonsuemheb does not forget what he has promised. He sends men to search for the ruined tomb, and they find it, 25 cubits distant along the King's Causeway at Deir el-Bahari, and return to tell their master. Khonsuemheb is pleased with this news and celebrates with the men, and afterwards summons an official to tell him about the project. The story ends with the line, "He returned in the evening to sleep in the Nay, and he..." But the rest of the tale is lost. The Nay in the line refers to the necropolis at Thebes, and it is thought that Khonsuemheb returns to where he was at the beginning of the story to tell Nebuchadnezzar that he will soon have a new home. End quote. And now I would like to turn to a text for a moment that I think I have referenced in every one of these episodes in this series thus far. Chapter 9 of Danse Macabre by Stephen King, the chapter titled Horror Fiction, includes this, quote, "For all of their mythic hold over us, the field of the supernatural is a narrow one in the greater spread of general literature. We can depend on the reappearance of the vampire and our furry friend, who sometimes wears its fur on the inside, the werewolf, and the thing without a name. But the time has also come to bring forth that fourth archetype, the ghost. We may also find ourselves returning to the tension between Apollonian and Dionysian, since this tension exists in all horror fiction, the bad as well as the good, leading back to that endlessly fascinating question of who's okay and who isn't. That's really the taproot, isn't it? And we may also find that narcissism is the major difference between the old horror fiction and the new. That the monsters are no longer just due on Maple Street, but may pop up in our own mirrors at any time. Later in this chapter, King continues, the concept of the ghost is to the good novel of the supernatural what the concept of Mississippi is to Twain's Huckleberry Finn. Really, more than symbol or archetype, it is a major part of the myth pool in which we all must bathe. Don't you want to hear about the manifestations of the different spirits here? The younger priest asks the older before they go up to Regan McNeil, before the final confrontation in The Exorcist. He begins to enumerate them, and Father Merrin cuts him off curtly. There is only one. We know that ghosts aren't inherently evil. In fact, most of us have heard or read of a case or cases where ghosts have been rather helpful. The shade who told Auntie Clarissa not to take that plane, or who warned Grampy Vic to go home fast because the house was catching on fire. My mother told me that after suffering a near-fatal heart attack, a close friend of hers had a visit from Jesus Christ in the hospital room. Jesus just opened the door of Emil's IC room and asked him how he was doing. Emil, aloud as how he was afraid he was a goner, and asked Jesus if he had come to take him. Not yet, Jesus said, leaning casually against the door. You've got another 6 years, you. Relax. He then left. Emil recovered. That was in 1953. I heard the story from my mother around 1957. Emil died in 1959, 6 years after his heart attack. I have even given some truckle with good ghosts in my own work. Near the end of The Stand, Nick Andros, a character who has been killed earlier in an explosion, returns to tell half-witted but good-hearted Tom Cullen how to care for the novel's hero, Stu Redman, after Stu has fallen gravely ill with pneumonia. But for purposes of horror, the horror novel, the ghosts must be evil, and as a result, we find ourselves back in a familiar place, examining the Apollonian-Dionysian conflict and watching for the mutant. End quote. King then moves on to say, quote, let us move now from ghosts to the natural, or unnatural if you prefer, habitat of ghosts. The haunted house. There are haunted house stories beyond numbering, most of them not very good. But this little subgenre has also produced a number of excellent books. I'll not credit the haunted house as a genuine card in the tarot hand of the supernatural myth, but I will suggest that we might widen our field of inquiry a bit and find that we have discovered another of those springs which feed the myth pool. For want of a better name, we might call this particular archetype the bad place, a term which encompasses much more, than the fallen-down house at the end of Maple Street with the weedy lawn, the broken windows, and the moldering for-sale sign. We are allowed to see a chain of hauntings working together to reinforce the concept of the house as a bad place. One might say that the truest definition of the haunted house would be a house with an unsavory history. The author must do more than simply bring on a repertory company of ghosts, replete with clanking chains, doors that bang open or shut in the middle of the night, and strange noises in the attic or the cellar. The attic's especially good for a bit of low, throbbing terror. When was the last time you explored yours with a candle during a power failure while a strong autumn wind blew outside? The haunted house tale demands a historical context. End quote. I just wanted to insert the line that Stephen King was writing this book in 1981 when people still owned houses. Now, the chapter continues, quote, both The House Next Door by Anne Rivers Siddons, 1978, and The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, 1959, provide this historical context. Jackson establishes it immediately in the first paragraph of her novel, stating her tale's argument in lovely, dreamlike prose. No organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. A bit later in the chapter, King continues thusly, quote, quoting someone else in this quote, by the way, nearly all characters of the American Gothic are narcissistic, Park sums up. In one form or another, weaklings who try to read their own preoccupations into reality. This sums up Colquitt Kennedy, I think, and it also sums up Eleanor, the protagonist of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. And Eleanor Vance is surely the finest character to come out of this new American Gothic tradition. The inspiration to write a ghost story, Linamaja Friedman writes in her study of Jackson's work, came to Miss Jackson as she was reading a book about a group of 19th century psychic researchers who rented a haunted house in order to study it and record their impressions of what they had seen and heard for the purpose of presenting a treatise to the Society for Psychic Research. As she recalls, quote, they thought they were being terribly scientific and proving all kinds of things, and yet the story that kept coming through their dry reports was not at all the story of a haunted house. It was the story of several earnest, I believe misguided, certainly determined people with their differing motivations and backgrounds. The story so excited her that she could hardly wait to create her own haunted house and her own people to study it. I will end the reading from Danse Macabre there, and just for a little bit of context on what we just went through, I did my best to present that as thoroughly as possible, but that was stretched over about 40 or 50 pages of actual text. If you do plan on reading Danse Macabre, be very, very prepared to wander about and tarry from the point. But now I think I would like to bring this argument home. Why do we love ghost stories? What are ghost stories? What are ghost stories good for? I think in order to really have some idea of why the ghost story is so inherent to our experience, we have to take a step back and look at it from a distance. And for this, I suggest we turn back to that original Wikipedia article that we were looking at. We get this, quote, in 1929, 5 key features of the English ghost stories were identified in Some Remarks on Ghost Stories by M.R. James, as summarized by Frank Kaufman for a course in popular imaginative literature. They were 1. The pretense of truth. 2. A pleasing terror. 3. No gratuitous bloodshed or sex. 4. No explanation of the machinery. And 5. Setting. Those of the writer's and reader's own day. End quote. And it should seem strange to us that something so seemingly ubiquitous through time would be able to more or less all hold true to these 5 ideas, and yet, mostly, that's true. Yes, the article does say quote-unquote English ghost stories, but we can go through ghost stories through most of time. The pretense of truth? Well, we can go all the way back to our original ghost story from the Egyptian culture where there was the pretense of truth in that ghost's story. The idea of a pleasing terror I do not understand, I'll be very honest with you. No gratuitous bloodshed or sex, there are neither of those in that story. Though, why would that be weird? Why should we note that there is no gratuitous bloodshed or sex in these stories? Well, if you look at regular types of religious stories going all the way back to those religions, the religions of Egypt, the religions of Greece, all of these very, very old religions, a lot of their stories have bloodshed. And if you were raising the question of the paranormal, almost all of those stories involve some type of sexuality. The idea that there is no explanation of the machinery, from what I remember in our Egyptian story, there is no explanation of the machinery or how it is that the ghost is manifest. And the setting, that those of the writer's and reader's own day, it was indeed a contemporary type story that goes all the way back to our very first ghost stories. But why? Why are these things true? Well, simply because on some level we understand that those are to be the truths, meaning that it is archetypal within us and or our understanding of what reality is. This type of storytelling is not just randomized, and it is because this type of storytelling must have some type of utility within what it means to be human, within what it means to be us. What is a ghost? A ghost is essentially the past and the future at the same time. If you were visited by the ghost of your weird Uncle Henry, your weird Uncle Henry had been alive. Your weird Uncle Henry is right now where you will end up. A ghost is the past, a person that comes to warn us about the future and death. This is perhaps exemplified nowhere better than in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. We get the visit from our former associate, Jacob Marley. Jacob Marley, who lived a very close life to Ebenezer Scrooge. Jacob Marley, who is in the afterlife saying, "Hey, Ebenezer, you gotta change your ways, buddy. I have been where you were, where you are. I am now where you will be." And that idea sounds familiar too, doesn't it? In our largely Judeo-Christian society. If that does not ring familiar, look up Masaccio's Holy Trinity. In the story A Christmas Carol, a different ghost shows up to show Ebenezer Scrooge the past. Then one shows up to show Ebenezer Scrooge the present. The idea being what you are not right now, who you are not being. You are wasting your life. You are wasting your time. You are a wretch, Ebenezer Scrooge. And finally, a ghost shows up to show Ebenezer Scrooge the future. If you do not change, this is what will become of you. And that is essentially the utility that ghosts have and always have had. They are the past, warning us of our own future. And ghosts are people, more likely than anything else, because we don't know about other animals, but we do know that we have an idea of the past being different than the future. We have some idea of the future. We do not believe that many animals do have ideas of the future, and we also believe that the future is malleable. And it is the malleability of the future that proves the utility of the ghost. Otherwise, they wouldn't waste their time. That is what I have for this episode. If you enjoy or appreciate what I do on this channel, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button in order to stick around for more. There is poetry on this channel every Monday. There are videos throughout the week. In September, I wrapped up 6 consecutive months of daily uploads on this channel about literature and exclusively literature. Check out some other videos, and guys, I hope to have you back for the next one.